How did the Black Death impact European society? Our collective perspective on the Black Death is largely limited to the health ramifications on the culture of Western Europe. However, the disease had an even greater effect on the societal structures and perspectives of Europeans. More than a pandemic, the Black Death transformed European culture in numerous fundamental ways. First, it impacted European society medically, economically, and socio-politically. So here's a little background / general info on the Black Death before I jump in. Here are a few common misconceptions. One is that the song Ring Around the Rosie had anything to do with the Black Death. It did not. It was just a folk song that originated closer actually to the 1800s, and the words were nonsensical, as the style was for children's ditties at the time. And later on, it was kind of given that meaning, even though originally it really had nothing to do with the Black Death. Not originally. The second misconception is that Black Death, the name for it, black, had to do with the discoloration of your skin when you were infected with the bubonic plague or whatever. That's not how it actually came about. It came about from this poem that was written by, let's see, did I write down the guy's name? I don't remember the guy's name, but there was a poet in the 14th century, and he wrote a poem saying the word was black or, terrible death. And then the translator decided to translate it to the word black, and black just kind of stuck. And then people were trying to think of the reason, and that just kind of became a rumor or a myth about it. Did not have to do with your skin discoloration. Quote, the idea that the Black Death originated in the blackened flesh of its victims is in fact a popular misconception. End quote. That's from Kay Jones. The Black Death brought about the decline of feudalism and the emergence of the Renaissance because of its effect on the medical, economic, and socio-political climate of the late Middle Ages. Okay, so first, it dramatically impacted the health of Europeans, so this is the medical impact it had. Alright, so there's kind of 4 subpoints to this one. First, it changed how Europeans viewed medicine. Second, it left a dramatic imprint on European genes. Third, it caused many psychological issues. And fourth, it slowed Europe's population growth. Okay, so the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1348, and by the time of its decline, 1/4 to 1/2 of the population had died. It struck again, which I did not know this, writing this Viva. I did not know that it struck again in 1362, 1368, and 1381, and continued to restrike periodically well into the 18th century. That was a surprise. The plague struck hard and fast. Once you were infected, you could die the next day, or you could not know you were sick, go to sleep that night, and die before you ever woke up. So it was pretty intense. But also, some sickness periods lasted up to 2 weeks. Graves were dug like trenches, and the bodies were piled up by the hundreds. Hundreds. That's a lot of dead bodies, and people dying quickly. The Black Death killed half the population, and the survivors were thrown into depression and religious doubt. So, survivors, quote, were like persons distraught and almost without feeling, end quote. That's from Agnolo de Tura. The art and literature of the time turned dark and morbid. There was a widespread image called the Dance of Death, depicting death choosing its victims at random. So, death was on the mind, obviously, because people that were living through it were just seeing their friends and family and their towns and villages and country dying off, people dropping like flies. So, unsurprisingly, people were considering the deeper questions of life. What with all the depression and death, patterns of stability in medieval society were replaced with psychological issues of the people, including hostility, greed, confusion, remorse, and abuse. Of course, people are confused, they're going through a disaster, so stuff gets weird, Christians break out in violence against Jews and killed many people, burned them at the stake. Other Christians, I'm saying Christians a lot because generally Christianity was the religion of the empire, so a lot of people were Christians in name, so some people some people were like, forget this, and started basically partying because they were like, who cares? We better enjoy life while it lasts. And then the other portion of the population was like, oh my gosh, we might die. We better, like, get better at this Christian thing. So they became really pious, some of them over pious and just downright rude, believing that God would preserve them from this plague that they believed he was sending on them to punish them for their sins. So people started to become like penitents and flagellating themselves with whips. It says on the streets, so I guess people were, like, you encountered the effects of this plague everywhere. You're just walking down the street, there are dead bodies, and there are people, like, hitting themselves with whips in, like, as, you know, I forget the word, being, you know, as penitents or whatever. Penance, that's what I was trying to say, not penitence. Yeah, so people were dying everywhere, in the street, by themselves, in their beds. The churchyards where you would bury people were full. There was no more room for dead people. And so they were being buried in trenches on the side of the road, anywhere there was a spot. And people were struggling to understand why this was happening. Some were turning to their Christian faith, and others really turned to astrology. There was apparently Jupiter was in the house of Saturn or something, which was causing all these issues, according to astrologers. The Black Death caused people to value medicine more than they ever had before. Not that everyone was, like, great at medicine at that time. Obviously not. Some people just started practicing medicine because they needed somebody to do it. And they knew nothing, and people died faster than they would have had old Joe down the corner decided he was going to be a doctor and start treating them. But they valued medicine in a different way as a culture than they had before. The Black Death proved beneficial in one way, that is, further along down the line genetically, because people of European descent now have this kind of genetic mutation that originated around that era that blocks HIV, smallpox, and the plague. So, and the Black Death. Oh yeah. So moving on to the last subpoint, that it also impacted Europe's population growth. Obviously, people died. So more than 20 million people were killed. That's an insane amount. So the disease spread from bacteria on fleas, which were on rats, and the rats were on ships. So trading, everything, it was just being spread everywhere. Came from Asia, then sort of first hit Italy and Europe, and then spread from there. It spread like wildfire, and half the population was destroyed, like I said. So the population dropped from nearly... Oops, this isn't right. It dropped dramatically and then continued to slow in growth again because, you know, those children were never born that they would have had, and then those children weren't. But slowly it was rebuilding, but it was like, there's a graph of it, and it's like, doop, you know, population growing, and then in a matter of years, 20 million dead. So as I mentioned before, the Black Death gave Europeans a genetic mutation, but this is actually more meaningful than it seems, because because so many people died, every single person of European descent can trace their lineage back to one person that was alive during that time. So literally everyone has that gene, which is kind of crazy. Alright, on to point 2. The Black Death transformed Europe's economy. Then there's 3 more little subpoints to this one. It increased wages, it changed agriculture approach, and it allowed Europeans to return to unfarmed forests. So the Black Death brought the economy spiraling downward. Merchants and artisans were dying, and so were the customers. So the economy was just like, what? Wages were rocketing upwards. Land was lying unfarmed, and landowners needed to renegotiate farmers' wages because there were drastically less farmers and a vast amount of farmland with not enough farmers to do anything, with not enough farmers to maintain it. So famine then followed, of course. Everything that could go wrong pretty much went wrong. And basically, death began to eat away at feudalism. the farmers were demanding higher wages, rulers were trying to keep wages down. Eventually, the result was the Statute of Laborers, issued in 1351. The statute demanded that every farmer work for any lord who wanted to hire him, because they were trying to keep the wages at the lord level, to keep the class feudalism in place. But, so then the statute continues to saying if the farmer wants to refuse, they were to be put in stocks and fined. But it was happening so much that they changed the punishment to be more severe. It was a prison sentence, and then if the farmer tried to escape, they could be branded with the letter F on their forehead. However, try as the monarchs and lords might, the statute of laborers wasn't too effective. Eventually, lords began to illegally pay higher wages because otherwise farmers just would not work for them, because they know they could make a profit out of this situation, so they were gonna. So, quote, wages increased because there were fewer workers, labor became more scarce. That's a kind of nice summarizing quote from Dr. Parker. As the farmers were scarcer and wages higher, lords were forced to turn away from grain as their primary ware and switch to raising sheep, which required fewer workers, and there was still a market for wool and meat. Grain just required way too many people to maintain large fields of grain, so sheep, you just needed a few shepherds, but people were still willing to buy meat and wool. So, with the higher wages, peasants were now able to buy more fresh food, so the market grew for that too. They started cultivating more fresh foods, and now these farmers could move to under a different lord, or perhaps some of them were able to buy their own land. So the power was beginning to even out between the lords and the farmers. What with a lower population, many fields and farms were abandoned, and Europe was reforested, because as Europe, in the height of its growth, had deforested and cultivated for farmland the entire Mediterranean basin, but this process was being reversed as people were kind of migrating away towards where people were, since people were just dropping like flies. And it had a huge effect on the reforestation of Europe. Lastly, for this point, the Black Death had a huge effect on monasteries because they were the ones taking in all the sick people, caring for them, and just a bunch of monks died. So it left actually a dramatic shortage in clergy after the Black Death passed, which led to basically a quick replacement of them with younger, ill-trained, and inexperienced people who didn't know the previous ascetic rigors of the monks' past. So some of the orders grew a little bit more lax than they had been. All right, on to point 3. It dramatically changed Europe's socio and this is supposed to say socio-political structure. Here are the subpoints. There was a central control of imports by monarchs. There were anti-Semitic attacks, and excuse me. It ended the dominance of serfdom and other manorial systems. All right, so first the monarchs. Monarchs really did not work in the empire's favor because they basically decided they made the whole affair worse because they prohibited exporting food, they set price controls on grain, most that is to say, and outlawed large-scale fishing. So here's a quote from Dr. Parker. At best, they proved unenforceable. At worst, they contributed to a continent-wide downward spiral, end quote. So the monarchs really weren't helping anybody out at that point, and the economy was just getting worse and worse, and people were just doing what they had to do, whether or not the monarch had outlawed large-scale fishing or not, Renewed religious fervor brought about the rise in, clear religious groups, because people were really going back to, holding more tightly to them. So some Europeans targeted Jews, lepers, friars, and foreigners, thinking that they were to blame for the Black Death. Jews especially were targeted because they weren't really being affected by it, for the obvious reason of them being just cleaner than everybody else for their own religious practices. And because they were isolated in the ghettos, so they weren't being touched by people that were infected, really. And they were pretty much free of the Black Death. So therefore, the Europeans thought that they had deliberately poisoned the wells to kill people. So it kind of brought about the rise in anti-Semitic attacks. Before the Black Death, the manorial system was already in trouble. It was kind of on the decline already. And the Black Death was the last straw for this system. Basically feudalism. Serfdom just fell apart at the seams. It was almost completely eradicated as the feudal system fell apart. Agriculture had changed. Villages were being abandoned and wages were high. So, like I said before, the power was being balanced between the aristocracy and the higher class folks and the peasants and farm workers. So basically, serfdom just didn't exist anymore. Lost my spot. Agriculture had changed. Lords were forced to give better terms of tenure, lowering rent in Western Europe. So lords would receive a fixed annual payment from the farmer or whoever. And then this farmer or peasant had use of the land, and both of them would have a copy of this agreement. However, serfdom wasn't quite completely gone yet. It still lingered in parts of Western Europe, and then after the Black Death, it migrated to Eastern Europe. Before the Black Death, only firstborn sons could inherit ancestral land. There was this change in the inheritance law. So that was what the law was before the Black Death. Firstborn son was the only one who could inherit ancestral land. But post-Black Death, all sons and even daughters began inheriting land. So that was interesting. I wonder why that happened. I don't know. After the Black Death, the aesthetics of Western Europe actually changed dramatically. The art changed. If you see like a side-by-side from one before and after the Black Death, it's like mosaic style, not realistic at all, mainly colors. You would see it looks almost like a stained glass, or it could be a mosaic. After that, it's a realistic painting that looks like, I don't know, completely different. It's striving for realism and beauty in a different way post Black Death. Realistic, detailed artwork. The Black Death also debatedly allowed the Medici family to rise to power. So, all in all, the Black Death set the stage for the Renaissance. In conclusion, here's the thesis again. More than a pandemic, the Black Death transformed European culture in numerous fundamental ways, medically, economically, and sociopolitically. Thank you.